Module 10, Results-Based and Debt-Related Finance. Imagine two very different conversations happening in the same finance ministry on the same afternoon. In one room, a donor says, "We won't pay you up front to protect your forest. We'll pay you afterwards, for each ton of emissions you actually keep out of the atmosphere, verified and proven." In the other room, the ministry is staring at a debt repayment schedule so heavy that there's no money left over for climate anything, and someone floats a strange-sounding idea. What if we could shrink that debt in exchange for a promise to protect nature? This module is about both of those conversations, because they're two of the most important and fast-moving corners of climate finance for a country like yours. By the end of this module, you'll understand three things: how results-based finance works, and why paying for outcomes is both powerful and frustrating, with REDD+ forest payments as the key example. How debt for nature and debt for climate swaps turn a debt burden into climate action. And why the crushing debt problem in vulnerable countries is itself a climate finance issue, including the clever idea of a disaster pause clause. Let's begin with results-based finance, sometimes called payment for results or pay for performance. The idea is simple to state. In the normal way of funding a project, money goes in at the start before anything has happened, and you hope the results follow. In results-based finance, you flip that around. The money is paid only after the results are delivered and independently verified. No result, no payment. Here's an everyday analogy. Think of the difference between paying a builder a lump sum up front to build you a house versus paying only when the house is finished and has passed inspection. The second way protects you, the payer. You don't carry the risk that the builder takes your money and disappears. You pay for a house that actually exists. Results-based finance applies that logic to climate outcomes. The most important example for you is REDD+. You know the climate side of this cold, so I'll keep it brief. REDD+ is the framework for paying developing countries to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation and to enhance forest carbon. What I want you to see is the finance mechanism underneath it. Under results-based REDD+, a country doesn't get paid to promise it will protect its forests. It gets paid after an independent measurement confirms that deforestation actually fell below an agreed baseline, and therefore that a measurable quantity of emissions was avoided. The payment is tied to verified tons. The Green Climate Fund runs a results-based REDD+ payment program of exactly this kind, and several countries have received payments through it. This sounds fairer than normal aid. You only pay for real results. So why isn't all climate finance done this way? Because paying only for results shifts a huge amount of risk onto the country that can least afford to carry it. Think about what results-based finance really asks. It asks a poor country to spend its own scarce money up front, hiring the rangers, setting up the monitoring, working with communities, for years with no guarantee of getting paid, and only if it succeeds, and only if the independent verification agrees, and often only years later, does the money arrive. If a drought or a fire or a political crisis knocks the results off course, the country has spent the money and gets nothing. So the very feature that protects the donor, pay only for proven results, is the feature that makes it risky and hard for the recipient. It also demands sophisticated measurement systems that many countries have to build from scratch. Results-based finance is powerful, but it works best as a reward layered on top of upfront support, not as a replacement for it. A country usually still needs grants at the front end to make the results possible in the first place. So hold two things about results-based finance in your head at once. It's disciplined and it builds trust, because everyone can see that real outcomes were delivered. And it transfers risk and cost to the recipient and rewards those who already have the capacity to measure and deliver. For a practitioner, the skill is knowing when to reach for it. It suits things you can measure cleanly, like tons of forest carbon, and it fits poorly with things that are hard to quantify, which, as you'll see next module, is much of adaptation. Let me add one practical wrinkle that matters in the room. Results-based finance doesn't only apply to whole countries and forests. The same logic shows up at smaller scales, and you'll meet it. A donor might agree to pay a rural energy company a fixed amount for each new household it actually connects to a clean mini-grid, verified by an independent check, rather than handing over a grant upfront and hoping. That's results-based finance too, and it can work well, because a household connection is easy to count and hard to fake. Development banks increasingly use a version of this at the government level, sometimes called Program for Results lending, where money is released to a ministry not against receipts for what it spent, but against agreed results it delivered, a certain number of hectares restored, a certain reduction in emissions, a certain number of resilient homes built. The appeal is that it focuses everyone on outcomes rather than on box-ticking about inputs. The risk, as always, is that it favors the governments and companies already capable enough to hit measurable targets, and can leave the weakest actors, who most need support, unable to play. As the practitioner in the room, part of your value is spotting when a results-based structure is quietly excluding the very people the money was meant to reach. Now let's turn to the second half of the module, which starts from a hard fact about your world. Many climate-vulnerable developing countries are drowning in debt. And debt, it turns out, is deeply tangled with climate finance. Let me build this up carefully, because it's where a lot of the live action is right now. Start with the basic problem, which practitioners call debt sustainability. A country, like a household, can carry some debt. But when the repayments get so large that they crowd out everything else, the country is in trouble. And here's the climate cruelty in it. Many of the countries most exposed to climate change, small island states, least developed countries, are also the most indebted. When a cyclone or a flood hits, they have to borrow more to rebuild, which deepens the debt, which leaves even less money for the schools, clinics, and yes, the climate resilience they need. Then the next disaster hits. It's a vicious cycle. Climate damage drives debt, and debt starves climate action. A government spending a third of its revenue on debt service simply has nothing left to spend on adaptation. Let me put one more piece of finance vocabulary in your hands, because it explains why so many vulnerable countries are trapped. When a poor or risky country borrows, it usually has to pay a much higher interest rate than a rich one, for the same reasons we discussed with the cost of capital. Lenders see more risk and demand more reward. So a small island state might borrow at, say, 8 or 9%, while a wealthy government borrows at 2 or 3. That means the same dollar of debt costs the poor country several times more to carry. It's a cruel arithmetic. The countries with the least money pay the most to borrow it, and the climate shocks that force them to borrow keep coming. When you hear people talk about reforming the international financial architecture, a phrase we'll return to in the final module. A big part of what they mean is fixing exactly this, making capital cheaper and safer for the countries that need it most. This is why debt is a climate finance topic, not just an economics topic. And it's why one of the most interesting instruments in the whole field tries to attack debt and climate at the same time. That instrument is the debt swap, and it comes in 2 flavors you'll hear about: debt for nature and debt for climate. Let me explain the mechanics plainly, because it sounds like magic until you see the moving parts. A debt for nature swap works like this. A country owes a large debt that it's struggling to pay, and that debt, because the market doubts it'll be fully repaid, is effectively worth less than its face value. An outside party, often with the help of an MDB or a philanthropic organization providing a guarantee or a loan on better terms, arranges to retire that old expensive debt and replace it with new, cheaper, longer debt. In exchange for that relief, the country commits in a binding way to spend a defined amount of the savings on conservation or climate action, protecting a marine area, restoring mangroves, funding a resilience program. Let me make it concrete with the kind of deal that's actually happened. A small island nation has, say, expensive debt it can barely service. A deal is struck, backed by a guarantee from a development bank, that refinances that debt at a much lower interest rate and over a longer period. The country's repayments drop sharply, and as a condition, the country legally commits to channel a large share of the savings, over many years, into protecting its ocean and coral reefs. Several island nations have done exactly this kind of marine conservation swap in recent years. The country gets breathing room on its debt, nature gets a dedicated, protected stream of funding, and the deal is structured so the commitment can't just be quietly dropped later. A debt for climate swap is the same machinery pointed at climate goals more broadly, funding adaptation or the country's own emissions targets, rather than specifically at conservation. If this is such a clever way to relieve debt and fund nature at once, why aren't countries doing it everywhere all the time? Because these deals are complicated, slow, and expensive to arrange, and they only free up a limited amount of money. Each swap is a bespoke piece of financial engineering with lawyers, banks, guarantors, and conservation groups all at the table, and the transaction costs eat into the benefit. The debt relief they deliver is usually modest relative to a country's total debt. It treats the symptom for one slice of the debt, not the whole disease. And there's a real concern about who ends up in control of the conservation money, and whether the commitments are designed with the country genuinely in the lead or imposed from outside. So debt swaps are a valuable and growing tool, and worth understanding well, but they're not a substitute for dealing with the underlying debt crisis at scale. Think of them as one clever instrument, not the cure. That underlying debt crisis is exactly what the big reform conversation is trying to reach, and this is where I want to introduce one specific, very practical idea you should carry with you: the disaster pause clause, sometimes called a climate-resilient debt clause. Here's the plain version. It's a clause built into a loan that says, if a major disaster strikes, a qualifying cyclone, earthquake, or pandemic, the borrower can automatically pause its debt repayments for a period, say 2 years, without being counted as in default. The debt isn't canceled. The payments are simply deferred, pushed back, so that in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, when the country desperately needs every dollar for rescue and rebuilding, it isn't also being squeezed for a debt payment. Think about how humane and sensible that is. Today, a hurricane can destroy a country, and its debt payment falls due the same month. A pause clause says, not now, deal with your people first, we'll pick up the schedule later. Several development banks and lenders have started building these clauses into new loans, and it's one of the flagship demands of the Bridgetown Initiative, the reform agenda led by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley, which we'll come back to in the final module. When you hear pause clause or climate-resilient debt clause in a meeting, that's what it is: automatic breathing room on debt when disaster strikes. Let me tie the debt thread back to the funds you know. This is also the space where the new fund for responding to loss and damage lives conceptually, money for climate harms that can no longer be adapted to. That fund, agreed at COP27 and operationalized in late 2024, with the World Bank as interim host and trustee, the Philippines as host country, and its inaugural executive director in place from late 2024, is a different instrument from the swaps and clauses we've discussed. Its early pledges have been on the order of only several $100 million, tiny against the scale of the harm. But it's driven by the same underlying reality: that climate damage and financial fragility feed on each other, and that when disaster strikes a poor country, the last thing it needs is to borrow more at high interest to rebuild. The pause clause, the debt swap, and the loss and damage fund are 3 different answers to that one reality, and a practitioner should see them as a family, not as unrelated gadgets. Each is trying, in its own way, to stop the cycle where climate harm becomes debt, and debt becomes a reason there's no money left for climate. There's a broader lesson here worth stating plainly, because it will shape your career. For a long time, climate finance was discussed as if it were separate from the ordinary world of sovereign debt, credit ratings, and finance ministries. It isn't, and the frontier of the field is exactly where the two meet. The most consequential climate finance question for a heavily indebted, vulnerable country may not be which grant to apply for, but whether it can restructure its debt, lower its cost of borrowing, and win the kind of automatic relief a pause clause provides, so that it has any fiscal room to act on climate at all. That's why the reform agenda led by figures like Barbados Prime Minister has moved from the margins to the center of the conversation. A practitioner who understands debt, and not just grants, is far more useful to their government than one who only knows how to fill in a fund application. So, to bring it together, results-based finance pays only after results are delivered and independently verified, with REDD+ forest carbon payments as the leading example. It's disciplined and trust-building, but it pushes risk and upfront cost onto the recipient and rewards those with strong measurement systems. Debt sits at the heart of climate finance for vulnerable countries, because climate damage drives debt and debt starves climate action. Debt for nature and debt for climate swaps relieve some expensive debt in exchange for binding commitments to fund conservation or climate goals. A clever tool, but bespoke, costly, and limited in scale. And the disaster pause clause lets a country automatically defer its debt payments when catastrophe hits, so it can put its people first, one of the practical reforms at the center of the current debate. Next, we move from instruments to themes, and we start with the hardest case in all of climate finance: adaptation, where the money is scarcest, and the reasons why go right to the heart of what finance is built to do.